talking about, the science of what learning actually is, and why we talk about learning being both social and emotional and also cognitive all at once, always, right? And I'm going to take you through some of the brain data that we have from my lab at Candle that show, I think, a really interesting story about what thinking looks like first, and then how thinking leads to the formation of memories that can then be called up and used in the future to solve all kinds of interesting problems that come your way. And how the neuroscience of memory formation, of thinking, of the emotional side of thinking, why we think the things we do, right? Because we think for a reason. We think because we need to, because it's on our mind, right? Because something is intriguing us. All of those are emotions, right? The emotion drives the thinking. And what that actually means for the way we design schools and for the role of teachers in children's learning and development, and for the kinds of practices and sort of experiences and capacities that we need to support our teachers in having in order to really be able for them to best support our young people. And so just to say, here I'm going to go through some of the data for what's happening in young people, in their brains and their minds, just to give you a sense. And then this afternoon, I have another session with my good friend Doug Connect, who is from the Bank Street College of Education and is currently the head of the Bank Street School for Children. And we're going to be talking about some of our work together, studying teachers and teachers' brains, the ways that teachers activate their brains when they are really effective, and what we can learn from that. So just to begin, I've started with this painting. I'm sure those of you who have seen me talk before, I use this painting a lot for kind of launching the conversation about what learning is and how it relates to brain development. We often think as just society, right? We think about the brain as being kind of separate from the human. We have and as a teacher, we have a whole bunch of kids in our class who show up with a particular kind of little brain in their head, and it's going to be some kind of a brain. Maybe there's some variation across this brain. So, one kid's a smart brain, and this one's a dumb brain, this one's an anxious brain, this one's an ADD brain, or a dyslexic brain, or whatever. And, that's not at all how we're coming to think of the brain in neuroscience. The way we think of the brain from a biological and cultural and social perspective is getting much more sort of a much better appreciation for the dependency of the brain on the environment around it and the person, right? So my colleague Margaret Lazari, who's a fine artist at USC, painted this painting, and if you look in real life, it's like a 6 by 8 foot vibrant watercolor, right? And if you look in the middle, there's kind of these white squiggly things, sort of semi-translucent, floating in this seascape, and they kind of look like reflections of the clouds, or maybe like waves or ripples in the water. And what they actually are is the white matter of one brave woman's brain, right? We put her in our MRI scanner, we took pictures of her brain, and then we peeled off the outside all of the little cells, the cortical cells that are kind of the bark around the outside that do the firing. We peeled them off the picture, not off the woman. Okay, just want to be clear. And then, what we have underneath in that picture is what we call the white matter. It's the massive, literally billions of little microscopic, fragile tails, tubes of salt water, basically, the tails of those neurons that are networking in very sort of evolutionary and experience-dependent patterns around that person's head, and in fact, all the way down through the space of her spinal cord, her body, all the way into her arms and legs and the ends of her toes and fingers. with the neurons they connect to. This is kind of the networked nature of our neurology, of our brain and nervous system. And what I love about this as a kind of visual metaphor for studying and thinking about the role of education and teachers in brain development, both in brain development of teachers, right, because we're people too, and in children, is it really highlights that brains are not sort of separate things that you kind of have, and then, you know, whatever kind you bring, that's where we start from. It's more like everyone is kind of bolstering up and sort of sloshing our brains back and forth in the whole culture in which we live. And that brain is sort of floating with little weeds tickling the bottom of it and the warm sunshine shining down on it and little red fish swimming by to represent the spontaneity of our creative ideas. And what I love about this as a way to think about the brain is that Margaret hasn't painted the brain as sort of an isolated object that we can all put on our special scientist glasses and study. She's painted it into this seascape of life, sort of semi-translucent, sloshing back and forth with the tides of the people and the situations around it, and kind of bolstered up and floated by the culture and the learning and the experiences we have. And that's how I think about brain development. Our brains are not we're not independent from each other. Our very biological well-being, our ability to think well, our learning are completely sort of culturally oriented, more than any other animal, we think, although it turns out that almost all creatures, both animals and other kinds like plants, turn out to be much more socially interconnected and communicative than we had ever thought. Now, as ecology starts to make great strides in understanding these things on different time scales, right, into different degrees of complexity, and humans are by far the most complex in this regard. This is really what makes us special, it seems, is that we come to the world just driven to interact with one another, to learn in cultural settings, to share with each other what we think and experience and to represent that to each other, and then to share and build what we represent into something that is sort of co-constructed with the people around us and the artifacts around us that we create. And all of this comes together to make a kind of almost collective consciousness that we call culture. And in that, the learning of the people who are engaging. And when you think about that as the basic evolutionary, psychological, and neurobiological substrate for the development of a human being to think in ways or to accomplish things, what you quickly realize is that the role of schools is just critical to this process. And it's also very different in many cases than the way we've conceptualized it in the past. That what we're realizing is it's really, really true, although it's been said many times, it's really, really true that we can't, there's a Danish saying that, I can teach you about it, but I can't learn you it, right? You can't give people things. You can't put things in their head. You can't, control what's happening in their mind. What they need is opportunities to engage with rich thinking around important ideas and skills, and to kind of switch us from what you might call a push model, where we as an education system and as teachers are giving kids stuff, pushing kids things at them and expecting them to return them in some form, like memorizing it later or deploying the procedures we've taught them how to do. Instead, turn this into what the brain is naturally about, which could be described as a kind of a pull model, right? Setting up a child or an adolescent's world, or for that matter, a teacher's world, right? So that there's rich opportunities around them to engage with ways of thinking and building and accomplishing and testing and exploring that they can pull in to their internal narrative, that kind of running story we construct about what it means to be us and who we are in the world and how the world works, and what that all means for what we do and how we make sense of things. All of that is the substrate of education. And when we do those things in ways that reflect what we might call disciplinary ways of thinking mathematically, ways of thinking scientifically, ways of thinking historically or analytically, or in literary or artistic expressive ways, all the ways that we can come at that kind of pulling of information into an internal representation that we construct, a model or a story about the world and who we are in it. That is the ultimate aim of education. And what our data are showing now, studying teenagers longitudinally across their development from age like 14 to age 20, is that it's kids' propensities to do this, to kind of pull information into that narrative and try to figure out in an active, curious way the bigger story of what's going on and what it means, not just right here, right now, but for the way the world works, for what I should know about this, for what I should do next. Those kids that are doing that, irrespective of their IQ, that grows their brains over time. We can literally predict, when we bring them back 2 years later, how their brains will have grown based on the degree to which they're inclined to be curious and engage with the world to make deeper meaning. That is an amazingly powerful statement about the pulling of an individual's information in to construct things, about the central nature of the person in the learning process, and sort of decentralizing the push model where we give things to kids and expect them to, like, volley it back, remembered the next week, or deploy it on the next test. We really have a much more constructive, internal, sort of personalized ability to construct meaning and to make memories. And that is what we're finding is actually growing kids' brains in really important ways. And in turn, after that, allows us to predict how happy young people are, how much they feel like their relationships are going well, how much they like themselves, how what we call coherent their identity is. In other words, how much do they say they know who they are, they're confident in themselves, as compared to, I just kind of go along with whoever I'm with, whatever they think is good is what I believe. I don't really have a strong sense of why I'm here or what my purpose is, right? How much they say that their educational or work opportunities are what they always hoped for themselves, right? That they're satisfied with those. I mean, the kinds of outcomes that we really care about for our young people are not predicted by IQ. They're not even predicted by their socioeconomic status in our studies or by their ethnicity. They're predicted by these young people's ability or inclination, disposition, to think in the ways that this brain image really shows us, to think in agentic, sort of active ways about what it all means. And I think there's a huge lesson there for the way we think about the role of teachers in kids' lives, the role of parents in kids' lives, and what really counts as the learning we want our youth to be engaging in. So this is a picture of, not me, I never put myself in my talks. This is a picture of my sister with my little niece, Nina. Nina was born in an emergency C-section when both she and her twin sister and my sister were all anesthetized. And this is the first time that Nina and my sister have met each other when they're both awake. And, Nina is about 2 hours and 3 3/4 pounds old. And the reason I show this picture, there's so many things we could talk about here, but the reason I show this picture to start this talk about the social and emotional nature of learning is, just to highlight that we come to this world driven to engage with one another. That is our biological tendency. That is what evolution has given us. And we bring that into the world where we land, and we start to gather up and pull in the ways in which the people around us feel and think, and we start to make some of those our own, and then we sort of metabolize them and digest them and construct our own awareness of who we are over time. And we do this in both biological ways and social and cultural ways all at once, that you really can study as a scientist or as a teacher the various dimensions of this process, the ways in which it's cultural, the ways in which it's emotional, the ways in which it's social, the ways in which it's cognitive. Any of that can be seen, for example, in this picture. But when the end of the day, when you think about these things, they're all of those things at once. What Nina is engaging in, what my sister is engaging in, all of it at once is all of those dimensions. And that's the nature of a whole person. And this is really what we mean when we talk about whole child development, that there isn't a separate child, like a Frankenstein monster, my friend David Daniel says, right? That you could carve up into like the reading brain and the social brain and the emotional brain and the, you know, the amygdala brain and all these different pieces we've carved up, that in reality, the ways in which we operate are ever so much more dynamic and integrated than that. And when they're not really thoroughly integrated, you have very problematic outcomes. You've got serious mental health problems. These things are always, always sort of different dimensions of the same thought process. They're not separate from each other. And so if you think about what Nina brings, the infant brings to this interaction, right, with my sisters. Here's my sister just completely, I mean, Nina's like, my sister's hands are the size of mine, right? This baby is teeny weeny, and she's holding her, you know, all at the right angle and holding her little hands in. She can't do her own hands and her posture and her head and everything. But as soon as my sister, the more developed human, comes along and notices, oh, you're awake and you're kind of in the mood to maybe like meet your mommy, okay, let's do it, right? Sets her all up, holds her at just the right distance, right? So, you know, babies don't see very well when they're first born, and their eyesight, they foveate most acutely at about 8 to 10 inches of distance. So, you know, does somebody take out a ruler and remind my sister, you know, for an optimal learning experience for your newborn to bond with you, you're going to want to get out the ruler, and just about 8 to 10 will do it, right? No, I mean, what my sister is reacting to there is that Nina is showing her that she's ready to engage. She's looking at her, and then, you know, they're kind of adjusting relative to each other in this kind of dynamic, what I like to call empathic resonance, right? They're kind of resonating with each other empathically to co-regulate one another's sort of situatedness and positionality in the ways that they can, given their maturational abilities. And ta-da, right? Out of that comes meeting your mother and staring into each other's eyes for the first time, right? What does Nina bring to this interaction evolutionarily? I mean, she brings a lot of things. She's managing her physiology remarkably well. Her heartbeat is going, and she's breathing the right amount for the amount of oxygen she needs, and she's, you know, doing all these temperature regulatory things and stuff which we take for granted unless they go wrong, right? And then she comes, when all that stuff is regulated okay, she comes built into her visual system at the back of her brain with a reflex that says, when you see 2 dark dots in this kind of configuration, not like this, not 3 of them, not moving around, right? 2 of them kind of like that, stare. That's what she brings biologically, right? And then along comes the social world and says, you've got this natural inclination to stare at dark dots. Hey, let's use that for something. I'll show you what that can be for. And that is how learning and development happen, right? And this doesn't just stop when you're 2 weeks old or 5 years old or 25 years old or 90 years old. We engage with one another around the kind of natural biological propensities and inclinations and affordances that we bring, and those get sort of triggered and embellished and specialized and recruited in the service of all the cultural, social, emotional, and cognitive learning that we do in whatever kind of life we have. And this is why our learning and our emotions and our sociality are really not separate. They're absolutely coming from this interface of engagement with perception of the world in a kind of dyadic, dynamic resonance, always, even if the thing that you're studying or learning about is something that we traditionally don't think of as being social. Although people who are experts in these things usually do think of them as somewhat social, like math, right, or something, right? That's an invented cultural domain in which we think about particular ways of measuring and quantifying and describing and noticing about, you know, the things around us or the things that we invent in our minds. And that's the legacy of our human intelligence, is that we can create these cultural spaces of ideas in which we construct meaning together. And the purpose of school is to facilitate and invite kids into those shared cultural spaces of thinking together, not just together here and now, but together with the historical figures of our past, together with the possible imagined futures of the children and of the world, right? We invent this alternate reality almost, only it is our reality. That is the cultural space of thinking and being together. And that is what learning is for. It's helping you enter that space. So just so you have a sense of what I mean, right, in terms of a kid's work, don't read this unless you're either a kindergarten teacher or really talented at reading little kids. But this is just you know, a picture I took of my daughter's you know, little song that she wrote one day when she was in kindergarten. And so she drew a little picture. I literally just scanned it, right? So she's got her little pink dress on, her pink shoes and her brown hair there, and she's got a little music scan with some squiggly music on it, right? So it tells you a little bit about some of the things she was working on at that point. And she wrote a song for her baby brother Theodore, whom she calls Teddy. And you know, I won't sing it for you. It's a little early in the morning here in California for singing, but I'll just read it. And she says, "Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual, but sometimes even more, as you make us proud and happy that you're you." So I have a simple question for you. Is this a song or a poem about this little girl's love of her baby brother? Or is this a song about her budding interest in planetary science? And I'm happy to report she's now an undergraduate student studying a new field called planetary health, which is about thinking about the co-evolution of humans and the planet and ecology, and how we can maintain a healthy planet and healthy humans all in one sort of way of living, right? We often think about our disciplinary knowledge, our ability to do science, right, or something very abstract and complex like that, and academic like that, as sort of separate from, you know, say, the way we love our baby brother. And that's not how human beings actually think. That is not the way we actually operate. It's not the kind of biology we have. And it's actually, we have something much more amazing that enables us in many more ways, both for good and for evil, right? We have the possibility of connecting ideas via our emotions. And this is going to be a major theme of my talk this afternoon about adolescent development in schooling, right? We have the possibility as a species of building our own internal model of what things mean. And that's a deeply emotional process. It's a deeply social process. And it's a process which leverages our kind of academic and scholarly ways of thinking and knowing. And when those are really integrated together, that's meaning making. That is where the real learning and development happen. And so here's, you know, Teddy, different kid. My point here is different kids do this differently, but they all do it to varying degrees in different ways. They all do it. This is what it means to be a living human, right? So this is Teddy when he was starting kindergarten, and you know, he's a different kid and a different skill profile, different set of interests. This is just a picture of a letter. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Nora's piece is a song written for somebody. Teddy's is a letter written for somebody, right? When kids are engaging and thinking and working, and frankly, when we are too, right? We do it to share with other people. We produce ideas, we think about things, we make art, we dance, we sing, we solve mathematical paradoxes in order to help others co-construct that more complex meaning space that we have together, right? Which is so deeply cultural. And so here's Teddy. He made a letter to me and my husband, his dad, right? And here's a picture of the outside of the envelope. Mom, Dad, Teddy, right? Little hearts and people and trees all kind of floating around, you know, how cute. And then like, if you look, like all the letters have little like monster faces inside them, right? Like look at that E on Teddy. It's like, it is a face, right? You know, what's that about? Okay. You know, Teddy's kindergarten teacher called me and said, Mary Helen, you know, I'm concerned about Teddy. I don't know what's going on with him, but he says that when he can't read the letters, because when he tries to read the letters, they look like they're staring at him and they're jumping around making faces at him on the page. I don't know what to do. I was like, well, you know, let's just wait it out. Let's just see how it goes, right? And then I was thinking to myself, well, duh, you know, when people learn to read, most people, not everybody, right? But the efficient way to learn to read that, you know, hopefully most people do, but not everyone does, is to co-opt the right fusiform gyrus, basically, in the left, right? To basically the same piece of tissue laying down on the underneath back of your brain, right? Where we naturally perceive faces. Why? Because the brain is struggling to try to figure out, and this is kind of an example of what I mean about how social and emotional and evolutionary and learning of academic skills is totally, you know, it's a big construction process, right? We're trying to read faces. We're trying to read faces all the time. That's natural. We need to do that. The only other animal that does it as well as us, it turns out, are like the dog family, right? Because they co-evolved with us, where facial expressions are really important, right? To be able to tell what your owners are going to do next, or, you know, who's going to throw you a scrap of food, or who's aggressive, right? And so human beings do this too. We're exquisitely good in, you know, typically, not everyone, and very inclined toward, you know, reading each other's facial expressions. And faces are the one thing in the world where when you see it, you know, slightly lopsided or skewed in a different direction, it's not necessarily the same thing, right? So if I see, you know, a book in front of me and I look at it this way and then I turn it this way, I can smart enough to know that when you turn it, it's still a book, it's just being seen from a different angle. But in faces, this is the one place where you need to be able to actually notice the laterality. So when people smile in ways that are the wrong direction or even, right, that's a sign that they're not genuine, that they're hiding something from you, right? And natural smiles and natural facial expressions are actually lopsided a little bit because of the way they're controlled by the two hemispheres of the brain. So we have a natural inclination to understand faces by keeping in mind their sort of their laterality, which way they're sort of tweaked. And the brain recognizes when you start to learn to read, which is a very unnatural act for the brain, right? It's not something that we're evolutionarily set up to do well, okay? When we start to learn to read, for many people, it's a process of recognizing that, oh, you know, there's this mirror of symmetry that you kind of need to recognize and break, right? Like that when you see one of these, right, it is not an upside down one of these, right? Or when you see one of these, it is not a sideways one of these. Knowing that is very sort of, that's a big revelation for the brain. That is not something that you see in nature. And how does the brain do that? And this kind of gives you a sense of the logic of our learning. It's, you know, tries to scramble and find, well, what was this kind of like? In what domain of processing am I sort of inclined toward thinking about things that are this kind of problem? Like, is it like this, or is it a genuine smile? It's in the fusiform gyrus. And I think what was going on here is that, you know, for whatever reason, Teddy kind of got stuck on the co-opting of that fusiform gyrus. And he's like, well, that's a letter, but it's also a face. It's looking at me, but, right, it feels like a face, but I know it's an E. I can't deal with this, right? And then he figured out his way to deal with it his own way. He put faces in all his letters. There you go. It's an E, but it's also a monster face. All right, great, fine. Look at me, right? And he managed his issue that way and went on to learn to read. And I'm very happy to report that, you know, within a few weeks he stopped needing to do that. And he reads fine now, although he's still a kid who has some like orthographic disabilities a little bit, you know, a little bit. Like, you know, spelling doesn't come supernaturally to him. He's a different kid than Nora, right? And now here's the inside of the card, right? You know, dear, oops, sorry, I screwed up. Dear mom and dad, right? Uppercase, lowercase, all mixed together, whatever. I love you! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Theodore! Exclamation point, right? You know, I was doing something around the house, I can't remember what, and he came up to me when he was writing this, and I didn't know what he was working on. I just saw him over there working on his table or whatever, doing stuff. He came up to me and he asked me dead seriously, Mommy, how do you spell Theodore? Right? We usually call him Teddy or Ted or lots of other cute little names, but not Theodore unless he's in big trouble, right? You know, how do you spell Theodore? So I told him, that's how you spell Theodore. I'm just curious, Ted, you know, why do you want to know? And he said, I'm writing you and Daddy my first letter, right? Kids use their new skills, those cutting edge skills they're barely able to do, like spell Theodore, in the context of socially meaningful activity. They don't just do it as an esoteric exercise. I did not sit my kindergartner down at 5 years, 4 months and say like, and now today we will learn how to spell Theodore. T, repeat after me, right? He came to it because he saw us bringing in the mail and he knew that he wasn't allowed to touch the mail, right? That's something that's not for kids, you know, stuff like that. Letters are important things, and I'm learning some important new ways of expressing myself. I could use that to do something important that would be a message to my parents, just like we get in the mail. I'm on it, right? And that's what motivation comes from, that connecting and that emotional kind of zap that happens when you realize and make the conceptual integration between two different domains, something you're learning how to do, like write a T and an H, and something you're also learning how to do, which is like, you know, interact with your parents more and more sophisticatedly. And here's the back of the envelope, right? And here we have Teddy, our budding engineer, now at age 15, who's all involved with, you know, building all kinds of prototypes of breathing machines for hospitals and all kinds of things he's all interested in, right? You know, and this is him. So, you know, he can't write an upper and a lowercase letters in the right place, but on the back of the envelope, I find this. And I said to him, you know, Ted, what is this? Tell me about this. And he said, oh yeah, those are instructions for how to open an envelope. I said, they are? He said, yeah. So it's color coded. Blue is like the arrow. That's where you're going to look. So when you're opening an envelope, the part you want to look at is the pointy part. Okay. That's where you're going to start right there. And I put a little box around it for you. This is right here is the point. And then what you do is you stick your finger underneath and you lift it up and up and up. And that's how you open an envelope, right? So, hello, here's a kid who's, you know, writing his letters like this, and we're working on that, but who's doing diagrams of engineering processes like this, color-coded, right? This is kids. This is all of us. We don't fit a little timetable where we all do it the same. We invent our skills ourselves when we have the opportunities around us to do that and the support around us to do that. And so schooling is a matter of providing the opportunities, the supports, the environments where kids are invited to construct and notice for themselves and build those skills. And that isn't just, like I said, for little kids. That's all the way up through high school and college. So emotions might be automatic responses to situations, right? Nora loves her baby brother. That's a pretty automatic thing. We didn't have to teach her how to do that, right? You have to teach her how to do it appropriately, but, right? Teddy, wants to do things that are important. He sees letters in the mail. He knows he loved his parents. He's, well, ding, that's a great match, right? For a skill building exercise, right? He has it in his head. So these emotions they automatically happen, right? In neurologically normal health and in healthy relationships. But I would argue that what learning is about learning how to feel. It's noticing how you should feel about the planet, how to feel awe about its huge ball of dirt spinning, making day and night, which is an amazing idea, especially when you're 6, although I still find it quite awe-inspiring, right? It's about learning how to feel. When you can feel really deeply interested in and excited about a mathematical idea, or about a scientific hypothesis, or about a literary tool that's used to express some kind of meaning. When you can deeply feel excited about those, then you fully understand them. And you fully engaging with them. And that is what good learning looks like. That's what builds memory in the brain. That's what makes us flexible. That's what makes us able to really engage with information and with our world in more and more skilled and nuanced and constructive, innovative, creative ways. That is what we are educating for. And so now I'm just going to show you a small clip, a couple of minutes long, of an episode of Nova in which we were featured, because it gives a sense of how we do our work with teenagers that I'm going to show you after this. What does it look like in my lab with the MRI scanner? And we have a very interesting paradigm, I think it's interesting, where we sit with kids, low SES kids, kids from poor neighborhoods, right? And poor families of immigrant parents, kids of color. And we sit with them and we just talk to them about how they understand and witness the world. What have they seen? What sense do they make of those things that they've seen, right? How do they think about themselves? How do they think about their futures? And we basically do that, and then we move them into the MRI scanner, and we look for developmental correspondences between what's happening in their brains, and we also measure things on their bodies, and what kinds of meanings and emotions they're experiencing. And the work that I'm going to describe comes out of that. So I'm just going to play this for you. It's just a couple minutes long.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Helen. Nice to meet you.
Since her days as a teacher, University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino-Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think, so there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime, they see a lot of dangerous things, they see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Swat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
And I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process.
Over here.
To find out which brain regions are harnessed during reflective emotion, Immordino-Yang monitors the students' brain activity as they re-watch the emotional videos in an fMRI scanner.
Hi, Estella. How you doing in there?
Good.
So we're looking at the movement of the blood flow in her brain as she's watching the stories, and where in her brain is becoming more and less active as she's experiencing these emotions.
She found that the reflective thinking caused by these emotional videos triggers widespread activity throughout the brain.
The most high-level brain states that people experience in the scanner don't just activate high-level systems. They also activate lower-level structures of the brain that are involved in regulating and monitoring your consciousness and your survival.
Immordino-Yang believes that the reason why learning and emotion seem so intimately connected is because complex emotion, like admiration, can activate basic brain functions, like those regulating breathing and heart rate.
We think that the reason that humans' values and belief systems and ideals are such powerful motivators is literally that they're hooking themselves into biomechanical machinery that has evolved to keep us alive over time. So emotions are a critical piece of learning always. Meaningful learning, learning that really matters to you, that changes who you are, and that endures over time, always has an emotional component.
So I would draw upon any of these.
Her research shows that engaging students on an emotional level makes for more powerful learning experiences.
So you get a little bit of a sense of what the experiment context looks like, and the data that I'm going to show you come from that experiment. So what we basically find, and this is Nina's older brother, right? Is that feeling emotions is just like little Gil here is showing us. It's like a reflection off of our own perspective. We construct direct perception, but of our sort of reflected reality. We use our ability to think to ramp up a kind of story in our mind that we build around self, around how the world works. And this is what meaningful learning actually is. And it involves the brain systems that literally feel and regulate your body and construct, consciousness in the most basic sense, consciousness as compared to coma, right? And out of that, a sense of self. And, meaningful learning always involves this kind of process, I would argue, because if the learning that we want kids to be doing in school needs to transfer, it needs to become part of who they are and their identity and their sense of belonging in school and in society, if we need them to call it up later and be able to apply it or innovate with it or change it and build from it, all of that kind of learning, is actually constructed via the meaning, the personal meaning that you make about something. It's never just about sort of, I tell you this, and if you can remember it next week on the quiz, then you know it. That's not what we really need in terms of knowing. And so here's just a little bit of a sense of what happened in the brain, right? And this experiment that I'm showing you right now is actually with adults, but the same thing happens with teenagers, but in ways that grow over time, which is extremely interesting. We'll talk more about it this afternoon for those of you who are interested. But we had a few basic hypotheses in the brain that we wanted to test when people were put in the scanner and asked to think about really important, interesting stories that are very emotion inducing, that have a lot of sort of cultural knowledge and implications built into them. And what we see first is that the emotions that people are experiencing when they say, I'm thinking deeply about this, I really care about it, I'm very moved by it, I'm really thinking. First of all, we can predict when they say that and they blink their eyes in ways that show us that they're thinking, which is very interesting. We can predict which stories they're going to remember 5 years later when we bring them back to the lab, right? That's powerful. This kind of thinking actually helps you to construct memories around things and to learn in the deeper sense. And here are the places in the brain where we saw more blood flowing, right? More neurons firing underneath and those pieces of cortex, right? And subcortex, excuse me, that were more activated when people said they were thinking about something really deeply, deeply emotionally moved by it, really trying to make sense out of it, as compared to when they said, oh, that's an interesting story, but yeah, I wouldn't say I'm that, compelled to think about it. Like, I'm kind of done, right? And unbeknownst to them, there were stories built in that weren't meant to be that interesting or that worth thinking about on purpose, so that we could make this contrast in the brain. And so what do some of these activations show us? The first thing is we have these very systematic activations in the brain stem, right? This down here, if you can see my little cursor moving up and down, that little thread going out the bottom of the neck is actually the spinal cord, right? We're way down at the bottom of the brain, below all the cortical stuff that we can consciously control, and is down in regions that kind of intermediate between the whole rest of the cortex and that thread of brainstem coming out the bottom. What we have there is, densely packed little nuclei and fiber tracts that are essential for survival. They make you able to be alive, awake, to know how to breathe the right amount for the amount of exercise you're doing or for how scared you are, right? To know how awake you should be versus how relaxed you should be, how to attend to something versus sort of reflect back and relax. Those very basic physiological regulatory functions that literally are the basis for your survival are being systematically activated and recruited in the service of deep thinking, right? Deep thinking is not something you only do at the top of your head. It's something that you engage all of yourself in, that makes you kind of more alive, more awake, right, as you do it. And over on the right, we have what's known as the anterior insula. These are regions of the cortex. Now we're up at the top of the head where things are folded underneath, way deep inside. What we know about these regions, comes from 1950s neurosurgery with patients with epilepsy, basically. When you poke around in there, when a person's awake, what happens to them is that they like get nauseous, they puke, and they get other kinds of gastromotoric responses, which I will not describe in polite company, right? They basically vomit. That same cortex that helps you know how to digest your lunch and feel how fast your heart is beating and whether or not you're sort of got shivers or chills or not, that same platform is where you think about things that feel really important and meaningful to you. Our emotional sort of platform and our embodied platform and our ability to think complexly about problems are not separate in the brain. They are literally co-opting the same regions and specializing those. And this is what I mean when I talk about emotion and sociality being ever present in learning. It is the substrate on which we come to care about and spend energy thinking about things. So basically, emotions activate the same brain systems that keep you alive, right? And then I just want to show you one other set of activations that we found. And this was really interesting. These are deep down inside the middle of the head. And to this point, in 2009, to my knowledge, nobody had activated these for any kind of task, right? When you ask somebody to think about math problems or to, watch what's happening, we're flashing these pictures at you, tell us which one happened 2 times ago, and keep, when you're really working hard on a task, right? These regions called the default mode network are suppressed in activity. They go quiet and they stop exchanging a lot of information with each other. And the way you activate these is by letting people sort of rest or relax in the scanner. Think about nothing. What is that really? We don't think about nothing as human beings. When we're just resting and relaxing, we tune down the outside world. What we do is we construct internal meaning. We start thinking about imagined futures. What's going to happen next? Why did that happen before? How do you think that person's feeling? Gee, I wonder how I should do this. You start constructing stories in your mind about things that aren't in the physical here and now, about what it all means, what it's for, how it could play out into an imagined future, what the history of the thing sort of comes together to tell you now. That's deep learning. And here's the thing I just told you. When you are activating these regions, you can't also be 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, everybody's watching the thing, moving their pencil on the paper, on task, doing this, not wasting time, right? You need time to assimilate and construct that internal sense of understanding. And what really good learning looks like is the ability to pivot out into the world where you get things done, you move your pencil, you try the procedure in math, you figure it out, and then you pivot back like a seesaw. And you think about, oh, what does that mean? How does that relate to the problem I did last week? What about how I would use that if I were an engineer building a bridge? And you're making an imagined space in which to apply and try out that knowledge hypothetically. And that's where deep learning comes from. So I'm just going to skip ahead on these. So basically, this default mode network is active during internal reflection, right? When you're kind of daydreaming, when you're imagining, when you're thinking of possible futures, when you're trying to make sense out of the past, when you're thinking about emotions and feelings that don't pertain to any real physical reality, but that are instead about relationships or beliefs or morals, right? Things that are constructed by us in our culturally shared space of knowing that we build, that I was talking about at the beginning in that painting of the brain floating, right? And so what this basically tells us is that thinking deeply, and the kind of thinking that leads to long-term, flexible, durable knowledge building and deep understanding, is essentially telling complex emotional stories to yourself about the things you're thinking about. Be they mathematical, be they social, be they artistic, be they in literature, in art, in history. And I leave you with these questions. What does this mean for students' well-being, for their character development, right? What might this sort of internal way of making meaning mean for how we use technology that's dinging at us all the time, where it's like, ding, you got the right answer, next Khan Academy problem, right? That is a way to learn. It's very important that we can do those things, but not at the expense of actually integrating. And we need to really think hard about how our education systems are enabling that deeper integrative process. How might it change the way we think about things like productivity and critical thinking, which may not be always about just sort of throwing back the answer. When I say, you know, what's the correct answer? You say letter B, right? So just to kind of bring this back to what real kids say that show us this, right? These are kids participating in our real experiments, right? Not the Nova one was a girl who did, but then came back just for fun she was an intern, and so she came back for fun to do the Nova special with us, but these are the real kids. And so one of the things that we did was we ran an NSF-funded science camp about being a neuroscientist for incoming 10th and 12th graders. And the kids don't know this, but we basically picked kids from around the city who were the poorest circumstances, kids living in homeless shelters, kids who were homeless, kids who lived with disabled aunts and uncles and grandparents alone and were the main breadwinners of their household. And we gave them a fully paid for opportunity to be our neuroscience assistants for 3 weeks. And I'm just going to show you how, these are some pretty bright, ambitious kids, right? How their thinking changed from the beginning to the end. So this is just an interview with them, a private interview at the beginning, in which we asked them, you know, what's a scientist to you? And they said things like, a scientist is good at science and math, needs to be able to answer all the questions, have the periodic table memorized, know everything about anything. It's very efficient, all about speed to be a scientist, right? A person who worked in labs all day, taking info out of rats. A person with glasses that is skinny. They have been studying so hard that they don't have proper health and are tired or weak looking. I always wonder why they want to be a scientist, if that's what they think science is, but anyway. A nerd, antisocial, and did not like having much fun, right? Same kids 3 weeks later. What's a scientist? Someone who can walk into a subject blindfolded and explore and eventually become an expert. How'd they learn that? Because we had them do it, right? Is constantly working with instruments, which may come with no set of instructions, but just persevering and sticking through it until it all works out. Almost completely opposite of what I used to think. Not only do scientists not spend all day in the lab, but they're constantly engaged with other scientists. They collaborate, very engaged, very open, cares about what others think and their ideas. Any person who is curious, right? What's going on here? They have shifted what a scientist is from what a scientist looks like and does, right? to that inner default mode way of thinking about a scientist. A scientist has certain qualities of mind, certain proclivities in the way in which they think, certain dispositions toward the world. It's a psychological capacity that you build and it can apply anywhere. That's what makes you a scientist. So to conclude, high quality education really, and we're going to deep dive into this afternoon, it accomplishes 3 goals, right? It helps students learn to build the kind of internal narratives that reflect the things they're learning in school, okay? And we saw that with Nora in the little poem, and we saw this with the kids in our science experiment camp. And it helps them expand the range of topics and skills and ideas that they're capable of recruiting in the service of enriching and continually re-envisioning these narratives, because it's not just about the things you directly notice, it's about opening your mind to the things that other people have noticed and invented in the past, the music, the art, the mathematical ways of thinking, the historical ways of thinking, the literary ways of thinking. We share those with kids in order to help them pull them into enriching that narrative about themselves. And we'll talk about some ways to do that this afternoon. And finally, last but not least, but always last, always in the service of the other 2, it provides targeted, situated support for acquiring the kind of building block skills that you need to access information, to solve problems, to communicate, mathematical and writing skills and communication skills. Those are in the service of story building, not the starting point. So emotions might be automatic, but we need to learn how to feel them. And that is in essence what deep learning is about. These are resources that are freely available, or the book you have to buy, but I donate all the proceeds to education causes. It's now available in languages all over the world. So if you have friends in China, it just came out there, they can get it. And I want to point you to this freely available PBS documentary that just came out this week that was specifically made for teachers about teaching in the pandemic and creating a kind of well-being space for yourself and self-care for yourself and for your students. And you can follow us on Kindle and get any research updates and things as they come available. And thank you.